Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I'm your host, James Mackey. Very excited to speak with you today. Our guest is Britt Harris. Britt, thank you for joining me.
Glad to be here.
Yes, very glad to have you. And Britt, could you please do a quick intro for everyone?
Yeah, I'm Britt Harris. I am the head of people at Hasura, and I've been here for just about a year now. I've been in the talent and people space, formerly known as HR, for about 16 plus years now. I'll leave it to 16 plus. Originally got my start in enterprise, was at a company of about 20,000 in size for about 8+ years, and then moved on to progressively smaller companies, some public, some private, a few startups. And that's really where I found my passion. Prior to Hasura, my most recent organization was actually acquired by a large enterprise organization. So I found myself back in enterprise. A little bit short-lived though. I realized my passion is really in the startup space. So I'm so excited to be at Hasura and leading the people team there and doing awesome things.
And Hasura, how big is your team at Hasura? Like employee headcount, stage
We're
of growth?
Sure. We're approaching about 200. We completed the Series C funding prior to my start, and we're still in that space. So I think right now our trajectory has slowed down a bit on the growth side with everything that's going on in the market. But I think we'll be looking at the 200, 250 as like the next milestone from a headcount perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, before we actually hit record, we were talking a little bit about the market, which I wanted to talk a little bit about to our audience. I don't know if a few of you are out there wondering like what in the world, like what are other people saying right now? Is it stagnant or are companies growing? So we could, I think Britt and I could both share a little bit of insight here on my end as CEO of Secure Vision, Talent Solutions. We work with a lot of companies to do like contract recruiting and better recruiting, all that kind of stuff. And we are not seeing a lot of growth right now. We're seeing a lot of false starts. Like we saw, it looked like there was going to be more hiring right before SVB, Silicon Valley Bank crashed. Then we felt like I think it was back in like April, May. It seemed like things were picking up. And then it's like we'll get this kind of flood of pipeline where companies are like, yeah, we're going to do it. And then it drags, decisions aren't made, executives go back and forth. Okay, we're going to hold. And so we're not seeing a whole lot of headcount growth. We're not seeing a big decline in hiring though at this point. It's more of this like steady plateau. So it's kind of been interesting to see. Britta, what are you seeing out there?
A lot of the same. And frankly, we're doing the same. We really, in lieu of making drastic changes to our existing headcount, we're just being very conservative about additional hires to the team, figuring out how we can leverage the skill set of people that we have to fill any gaps so that we can, give a little bit more security to the team that we have. And to make sure that everyone's got a full plate of things to work on, which never has been a problem historically. People have lots and lots to do, but we want them to feel good that, they're in a good spot versus continuing to bring people on and then having a worry that we're overstaffed for what our trajectory looks like. So we are being pretty flat in terms of our headcount. But the reality is that very talented people, highly skilled people are mobile in any economy for the most part. So we do need to be mindful of, retention efforts and making sure that we're keeping our team engaged and happy because we want to retain our top talent. And, even in economies like this, they can still find another opportunity. So it's a bit of a balance of, keeping everyone's plates full, being very thoughtful about each additional headcount we do add, which is not very many, but then also making sure we're focusing on retention so that we can keep the team that's there happy and engaged.
Yeah, it can always be a little bit tough when it comes to sometimes even like employee engagement and thinking about retention strategy. I think why it's, even if you feel like you aren't going to have a retention problem, or attrition problem, I suppose, either or, over the next few months, the reason you need to be focused on it is once the market starts to rebound, if you haven't made those investments, people are going to start jumping right when there's an opportunity to grow the business, which is like the worst time. And I've been there where it's like, okay, we get through this storm, we get to the other end, and then you have a key person leave and you're just like, no. and even, like I've had a situation, I hired a leader that like we hired him when he got laid off, right? When the market was terrible during COVID. And he worked with us throughout COVID. And I was like, okay, that's great. We got him in. He's gonna be ready to help us scale. And then like right when the market started to rebound, he was out and we were like, damn it, now we don't have a leader to come in.
Yep.
And so then that like set us back a couple months when that was insane growth we had coming out of COVID. And so we missed
Yep.
out on some of that. So I think you got to get ahead of that. What are some things that you're doing from a retention standpoint and an employee engagement standpoint? I think they're sort of tied at the hip, maybe sort of. So like that is forward thinking to make sure that not only people stay now, but really the big threat is when the market rebounds and people have a ton of options. How do we keep great people?
Yeah, it's challenging, especially because I think historically most people think of retention efforts, in the context of compensation. And when the market is what it is right now, everyone's being very mindful of additional spend. And so you're not necessarily looking to, make a lot of compensation changes in an effort to retain people. So you have to get creative to say, how can we keep people committed to our organization if we can't necessarily, give them bonuses, give them, significant pay increases, what does that look like? And for us, it's really making sure people understand how their particular role is contributing to the company's success, that they see the connection between the stuff that they're doing every day and what our, growth outcomes are, but also that they see a path for growth. Like they need to be able to see what that 1 year from now looks like, even if it's not our company growing by 50% in size. What does it look like for them? What are they doing that's different from what they're doing today that they can look forward to and build up to in the next year? Because that's a lot of times what people are looking for in the next job is, what skill set is this going to let me build, learn, grow, exude in that next opportunity. And so if we're able to give them that within the organization, and you also have to make sure that, there's a good culture, that there's good communication, that they have, good day-to-day experience. But if they can see what that path looks like in that organization, a lot of times they're going to be more open to weathering the storm, and kind of letting that play out and seeing what happens. But all those things kind of have to be in alignment. You can definitely throw money at these situations, but it typically will not have the longevity that you hope it will, because again, highly skilled people can command those higher salaries from other organizations as well. And once those budgets start to open up and once those headcounts start to open up, they'll be able to, easily go to market and get that. So if you haven't addressed those other things within the organization, their day-to-day work experience, what their growth path looks like, what those opportunities for them look like in the future, I don't think compensation changes are going to be enough to keep people in the long run. So I would say definitely making sure it's looking at their total experience, but also like what their growth trajectory looks like within the organization.
Yeah, I think the issue with comp is if you're doing comp properly, it should be competitive, but it's probably not going to be top of market. There's always, in a growth market, particularly in the startup growth stage world, there's always going to be companies that are hiring at unsustainable rates that are well above what's actually, again, like sustainable for their business. And those are the ones that have to cut the deepest and the messiest. And so you got to think, like, if you were truly the top bidder for talent, you're probably not doing it the right way. You want to be, and there hasn't been like a double-blinded tested academic study on this, so I don't know, but I would assume like you kind of want to be in like the 80th percentile of compensation, 75 to 80. You want it to be competitive. You want it to be better than the median. But if you're bidding top dollar, you can't do so responsibly is what I'm getting at. And you can't do so sustainably, because there's always going to be the hot new, A to Z company on the block that gets the 100 million, is going to hire a bunch of people and waste a ton of money. And you just can't compete with that. Or, Google or Microsoft, right, might just throw like 400K at an engineer. So
Yeah.
I think it's like you have to have a holistic package. You can't just rely on comp.
And a lot of those people who are earning at those higher levels have very high thresholds for what they expect of an organization. So they're expecting you not just to have the compensation, but they're expecting to have a growth path within that organization, whether it's to leadership position, whether it's to, deepening their technical skill in a particular area, whether it's having influence on the strategic direction of their particular team or the organization. So, just incentivizing them into the organization with the compensation isn't going to be enough to keep them there, because usually they're going to want to have a critical influence in the organization. That's generally what draws people to startups, in addition to compensation, equity, and some of those other financial pieces.
Yeah.
People want to see that quick impact. They want to see from inception of idea to execution, to outcomes. And so at those higher salaries, that's absolutely part of what they expect. And if you're not prepared as an organization to give them that as part of their work experience, they're not going to be happy, and they're going to be able to find another company to match that compensation who will also give them that experience that they're looking for.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's the balancing act for startups in early growth stages, knowing, okay, like how much should we be emphasizing candidate and employee experience? And so the analogy that I give is like, imagine, a lot of startups say this to talent, but if you flip the script and imagine like a startup or growth stage company saying this to a customer, like, hey, just so you know, if you join us as a customer, you're going to have practically no onboarding support. We're really looking for customers that are scrappy and can figure it out on their own. Do you want to join us? Right. And like it sounds so stupid. Like nobody obviously would communicate that to a potential new customer. Like, hey, you're going to get nothing from us and you should be feel blessed to be here. It's like, how would that be received by, like, you know what I mean? Like, and so it's like, but on the talent side, I'm saying that, look, I get it. Like we need to hire people that are adaptable, that do well without a ton of structure. Like, I'm not saying, I know there's someone out there like, whoa, what about, I get it. Yeah. What I'm saying is like, you have to make the investment and see the business as two big demand gen funnels, right? You have customers, candidates, and you need both of those things you have to have great customers and great employees to create a thriving business that scales.
I think it's really a balance of giving a realistic picture of what the job is and what the company is and where the company is in their life stage, and also some salesmanship. Like you said, no one's gonna want to come into a company where they're like, we have absolutely nothing to help you get up and running. You're gonna have to basically ramp yourself up, and then you're gonna just kind of be out there like figuring it out alone. But like, we hope you'll join us. Like, that's not really going to entice people to join the company. That being said, you also want to make sure somebody really understands what they're getting themselves into, especially if they're coming from outside the startup space, which a lot of times, depending on where you are in your organization, you do need to start shifting the talent that you're looking for to blend in some people who have a little bit more enterprise experience, because that may be ultimately the goal that you're trying to get at. So, having somebody that can be scrappy and can create something from nothing is great. But then you also need people who've seen enterprise and who can create something that can mature into an enterprise program at some point down the road, so that you're not having to go back and undo a lot of the work, but you're rather just maturing it over time. And so finding that balance in the candidates is really important, and having those deep conversations with candidates may seem like a heavy lift with a very aggressive recruitment process, which a lot of times it's like very time sensitive, but it's super important to make sure you're getting the person who's going to be enriched by the role, but also bring something to the table that's going to be critical for your organization.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I there's an episode that Britt, you might want to check out on the show, episode 98 with Anthony Onesto. And for everybody tuning in, that if you like this topic, definitely check out that episode. But what Anthony talks about, like you were just talking about, you want people, there's a scrappy kind of startup environment, and then you also want people with enterprise experience. Another kind of interesting kind of parallel of sorts, similar concept is, we were talking about, like I one of my LinkedIn posts was like, hire people that have done 75% of the job. The 25% they don't have is why they're going to accept your offers. A players don't accept offers for roles they've done 100%. That's like one of my most successful posts of all time. We got like 5,000 plus likes, a ton of views, all this kind of stuff. And we were talking about that with Anthony, and he was like, well, yeah, that's like, you need that, but you also need the people who have been there, done that. And you have, based on your growth stage and the company's objectives, you have to figure out for which roles you want one of those things and what percentage. Like, you need somebody that's just like done it. Maybe there's a little nuance, but they've done pretty much everything, but they're excited to do it because of the mission. They're excited to do it again for another reason. And then you want the people that are like pushing up, right? They've done 75, 80% of the job, but they're really excited to tackle that 20%. And, being able to diagnose, okay, of the 80% that we need them to have, what is that? And then what do we know they can learn? So I thought it was interesting. It's like, as a good rule of thumb, I think having growth for people in a startup environment is important, but you're right. You need somebody with enterprise experience, or you need somebody who's been there, done that, can bring some process to the table as well. I think both of those types of profiles are pretty important, right?
Yeah, and the type of stretch that a job opportunity can be for somebody is something that can vary depending on the person. You can have
Sure.
somebody who has the enterprise experience and the startup experience, but maybe they don't have that global experience. Maybe there's a particular region of the world they haven't supported. And so, 20% for them is geographic support and like learning, in that particular region and market, how to take what they know and apply it in that particular situation. We had someone join our team who had lots of experience, but only on the enterprise side and not on the startup side. And so for the particular role that we were having them join for, that was okay because we actually wanted someone who could come in with a little bit more process structure and start moving us in that direction. And it helped show the value add to the organization of, this is why these things exist this way in enterprises. This is why we need to start scaling in this direction because they've been proven to be successful. And this is how we can take that and kind of adapt it down. So that 20% could be a variety of different aspects of their skill set that, may be a stretch for them. So again, like having those conversations with the candidate and really understand what it is that they're looking for in their next role. What are the, opportunities that they've hadn't had a chance to fulfill in their own particular like career path, and can your organization help them achieve that? I think when you find those good matches, you can really have some like good synergies in the role that you fill. And then you're going to find somebody who's not only talented and skilled, but they're excited to take on something new and get that kind of like rejuvenated energy that they might not have had by just taking like a lateral move into another position at a similar company doing something that they've already done.
Yeah. And I think too, it's like people are just wired different ways, not only in their capacity to learn, but it's also like for instance, for me, like I need to be doing new stuff. I need to be learning and growing for me to be like super passionate. And I feel like my buy-in and interest levels are like my capacity to get things done when it's something newer is so much greater. And then when it's like a process is built, it's ideal for that to be handed off as quickly as possible because it's just like I don't like I'm just not I
I'm
don't
done
it's
with
very
it.
yeah,
Yes.
it's very hard for me to stay engaged. It's just like there's
Yeah.
like it's good to be aware of your weaknesses and to work on them, but it's also good to be self-aware on like what you're good at and what you're not. And it's just like I hate it. I hate doing like these like there's certain things I like doing over and over again. Like I like hosting my
Yep.
podcast. Like this is fun.
Yep.
But like
Yep.
there's things operationally for my company that I don't like. I want to be focused on like what's the highest leverage thing I can do once. And
Yep.
then but then other people like they like refining and they like the details and
The
like
tweaking.
optimizing and tweaking and they like that
Yep.
ongoing piece. And maybe they would think taking on a new project every quarter would be way too stressful and they don't like the uncertainty surrounding it. So I think you're right. Like it also depends on the person and maybe even like considering that when it's like you're hiring for a role, right? Like as you said, it's like who do we want? Like what kind of personality, right?
Yeah, I think I've seen some managers kind of fall into this trap where they have like what their defined idea of a successful path is. And so they kind of project that onto other people. And, I remember I remember a lady that I worked with earlier in my career, and it was at a larger enterprise company. And they were trying to level up the people team at the time. I think we were still called HR team. And so this particular person, they kept wanting to give her stretch assignments. Now, this particular person, she was in a later stage of her career. She had had a full career, and she was kind of like a file clerk or the equivalent back then. And so they would always kind of like try to give her these stretch opportunities, put her on a committee, like really get her out and engage in the business. And I think there's one day where she just kind of was like, I just want to file. Like I've done all those things. And the thing was, she was immaculate at her job, did an awesome job filing. Like she knew any piece of paper you were looking for, she knew where it was. Everything was
That's
like
awesome.
perfectly organized. And that's a hard job to be excited about. So, I mean, the fact
Keep
that she
her
had
keep
passion
her
for it,
happy.
keep this woman happy. Let her do this filing and leave her alone. But
Yeah.
like the manager just kind of had this idea of like, well, don't you want to grow? And she's like, no, I want to do this really well. And she did. There were times where she would make a recommendation for how to switch something up or do something a little different, but it was all in the scope of like what that job was. And so I think we have to be careful. That's an extreme example, but I do think we need to be careful and thoughtful that we're not projecting like what we think, the pathway to success or the growth trajectory should look like for any one person, because there are people who, for whatever reason, be it, their personal life or their career aspirations, their capacity with other things they have going on in their lives, what they want their next step to be and what they want their growth path to look like is going to be very different than what we may consider the norm to be. And so we need to make sure that we're listening in those interview conversations or even in those development conversations for, internal mobility, to make sure that, it's a mutual interest there and it's a mutual fit, because those are going to be the ones that are more long lasting and more successful than when we're just trying to, put onto someone what we think that path should look like and that growth should look like.
Yeah, actually, that's happened to me as a leader. It was like I had a great employee that was actually a sourcer, and she would crush it. Like her output was just nuts. She was contributing to a ton of hires. And so I was like, we really got to get you in full life cycle. You're doing so well. Like, I think our clients would love you to be, client facing. It's going to be great. And she was kind of hesitant. And I was like, well, we really want you to give it a shot. Yeah. She left like 2 weeks after we put her in the new role. I was so bummed. I was so upset. I was like, damn it. I keep saying, I feel like I said, damn it, now 3 times on this episode. But anyways, yeah, I was like, it was just so upsetting because I was like, and I learned my lesson. I was like, I'm going to let people be. If they, say they want something, then if it's the right fit, I'll make it happen. But, not everybody wants that level up to that. I mean, sure, it might be a little more money, but it's a lot more responsibility. Maybe they just don't like the extra stress. I mean, there's a lot of reasons.
I think they want to know that they have the option to, if they decide to. And I think they want to know that they have the trust of the business and the confidence of the business to be given the opportunity if they want to. Like, that in itself is meaningful, just to know that, hey, you've earmarked me as somebody with high potential. And so if I decide that I'm ready for the next step, you're open and ready to give me that next step. Like, that in itself can be meaningful. It doesn't have to be actual implementation of like the job change, because like you said, for whatever reason, people have, an affinity toward a certain type of role. So, I think that all of that, again, it's really about listening in those conversations. One of the roles that I hired for, I remember the individual I was like, do you have any questions? We'd had a couple of conversations, and probably more than what was necessary to actually like ascertain her skill set. And she was just like, I just really appreciate that you've had so many conversations with me and you really making sure I feel comfortable with the sleep. And I'm like, I would rather spend an extra hour or 2 hours with you now than spend another 3 months trying to find another person if you come and you find out that this isn't what you thought it was going to be in the right fit. So let's explore all of those different things now. Let's take the time. This is as much an investment for us as it is for you. You're leaving a place where you're connected, established, you've demonstrated success, and you have a growth path to come somewhere else and take a chance with us. We're obviously taking a chance to invest in you and kind of, train you in some areas and give you exposure in some areas you haven't. So we're both putting time, energy, and effort on the line here. So I want to make sure it's the right fit. Let's have those conversations now. There's no need for it to be awkward. I even tell my team now, I'm like, I'm not under the impression that any of you are going to retire from this company. That's just not the world we live in anymore. People aren't going places, for the most part, to work for 30, 40 years until they retire. So if I already know that you're not going to retire from here, that means one day you're going to leave, which means we can talk about it. It doesn't have to be taboo. Let's put it out there. One day you're going to decide that we have outpaced each other one way or the other, and that your next step is probably outside the organization. As a leader, as a mentor, as just a good teammate, I want to make sure that you're poised to go to that next opportunity and be successful, because you're still representing our company, you're still part of our network, you're still, part of our profession and industry. And so I want to make sure that you feel well poised to do that, because in the process, we're still going to benefit from it as an organization by having you be able to work on, projects and, provide a value. And then you're going to get that skill that'll prepare you for the next thing. And hopefully it is at our company, but sometimes the structure of the organization doesn't always support what that person's next step is. And that's okay.
Yeah, you want to know, you have to, I think, have open conversations about long-term goals and what they could see themselves doing in the future at your company or at somebody a different company. And that's important. I mean, because it's also gives you a heads up if somebody feels safe enough to say that they might be leaving. That's a great culture for one. They're more likely to stay, but also it gives you time to decide,
Prepare.
okay, yeah, is there a way to keep to want, if we want you to stay, is there a way for us to do that? And if we can't, then is there a way hey, do we need to spend some more time to write out process documentation to help with transitions, to make sure there isn't any kind of knowledge gap? So it could be a great way to make sure people can stay and increase tenure. And it's also a great way to make sure that you can iron out any process that you need to, so there's not a knowledge gap or customer experience gap or, whatever it might be. Right. I think it's, having those conversations more are important. And, you try, not everybody's always going to tell you exactly what's in their head, because they're just too kind of
Correct.
conditioned or
Yes.
nervous or whatever. But
Yes.
yeah, you try to, I mean, every once in a while, people that are reporting to me, I'm like, hey, what's going on for real? Are you happy here? Do you think you're gonna stay? Do you feel what's going on? I really just want to get a pulse for where you're at. And, we have these goals over the next 12 months, and I really want you to be part of it. And just trying to get a sense for if you see yourself, continuing, or, are you looking for this next step with us? If so, or if it's not with us, what do you need? Where do you need to be? I try to have those conversations. I think most of the times, folks are pretty honest about it. It hasn't been 100% of my experience, but more
Yeah.
often than not, as long as you're cool about it and you give them good feedback, and they know that you're going to be respectful of, their thoughts and feelings, that kind of stuff. It's never been ill received. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
It's only
Yes.
helped
Yes.
for the most part.
And, I have to be realistic, right? I don't think anybody's going to come in and be like, hey, 3 months from now, I'm going to put in my 2 weeks notice.
Right.
That's not necessarily what I expect. And I don't think that's realistic. Like you said, people have just been conditioned to kind of hold some of those things closer to their chest. But I think it's more along the lines of when they do come in to give their notice, it's not a surprise. It feels like, yes, this makes sense based on kind of what we've been talking about. If I'm doing my due diligence and sharing with my team where the organization is headed and where our team is headed in terms of the things that we're going to work on in support of where the organization is going, it should be very clear to both me and them what the next step for them looks like if they were to stay at the organization. And I try to be, pretty transparent with anybody who's reported to me, in that, the company has to have a need for it. It has to make sense in terms of where we're going as an organization. I can't just promote people to people managers or to certain levels of roles just because they have a certain amount of tenure. The work has to demand that type of contributor. And so if the work isn't there, we can definitely try to find other ways to give them that growth that they're looking for. But if they have a very narrow kind of path that they want to go down, that may make it more difficult for us to align with that as an organization. And so in those situations, it may start to kind of feel like it's leaning in that direction where that person probably is going to start looking externally, because, where our organization is going is just on a different wavelength than what their next step probably looks like. But again, just trying to take, kind of the awkwardness out of those discussions and be able to have those, I think, is the first step. And like you said, everyone's not going to necessarily feel that comfort, but I think if we create the space where they can do it, those who feel more comfortable will.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also knowing when to push to keep somebody versus knowing when to let go based on if they want a very specific path. So if they're looking for a path and they're passionate about it and you can't offer it to them, well, it's important to not follow the trap of trying to sell them on staying to continue to go down a path they don't.
Correct.
Because their engagement is going to be lower. You're probably wasting your time. They're probably not going to go for it anyways, even if you try to give them another 20, 30 grand or whatever. Probably not going to go any, and it just even if they do stay, they're probably going to leave 6 months later. It just it just doesn't, it hasn't really worked in my experience. It's better to just like, if it doesn't, it's either aligned or it's not. And
Yeah.
if you can't get it to the point where it's mutually beneficial or it's aligned, then it's better to just let it go than just continuously fight for it.
Yeah. And I think, one of the, you know, benefits of being in a smaller organization is that people do get exposure to so much more than they probably would at an enterprise organization. They may not have the number of openings that are available for internal movement, but within the role that they have, they get exposure and experience that they wouldn't necessarily get at a larger organization where the roles are so segmented, because here, they're wearing multiple hats. So, a lot of times you're going to be able to give them a pretty rich experience just in the nature of like everyone having to wear so many different hats. But yeah, I mean, I think in doing that, people start to figure out like what they enjoy doing most, what they would prefer to move on from and not have to do again. And then you can start seeing, the lights click on for them, and they start making decisions about like what that next step looks like. So just trying to have those discussions, I think, is really helpful. And again, just making it not taboo. I think that's the biggest thing, is to the extent that we can call these things out as like very normal things in the life cycle of a team member, in the life cycle of an organization. I think it starts to help those conversations happen a bit easier.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things we want to touch on is particularly how like interviewing for leadership roles has taught you a lot more about how to hire, finding alignment. How do you want to jump into that topic? Like, is something top of mind there?
Yeah, I think it's, having joined this company relatively recently, I say it's been a year for me. I think back to my own experience kind of in the interview process. And actually, at the time that I started the process, I wasn't particularly looking, but was open to having conversations just because I had been connected through a former colleague of mine. And, I think it's interesting. I've noticed this kind of in my own path as I've changed roles and changed organizations, is that as people gain experience, gain exposure, they start to kind of really have that more narrow focus in what they're looking for in the next opportunity. And I think from the time that I first started, as a person within HR, but also as a person who was interviewing for jobs, there's just been such a shift in the way people approach the interview process. I remember even learning in school, like, okay, you need to look at the job description that's posted, and then you need to formulate your resume to match the job description, because you want all of the keywords to match up. So when they look at your resume, they see all the things in their job description, and you're really trying to present yourself in the scope of what they're looking for. And I think over time, certainly personally, but also I think I've seen in the market a shift where people are like, hey, this is actually what I'm good at, and this is what I'm looking for. And if there's a mutual fit with your organization and the role you're hiring for, great, let's talk. But if there's not, that's okay too. And I can keep looking and hopefully find something that is going to be that right fit. So I think the conversations are starting to shift a little bit more, where candidates are feeling a bit more empowered to be vocal about what kind of organization they want to work at, what their skill set is, what they're looking for in their next opportunity. Certainly, I think this happens more at the leadership level, because those types of discussions are, a lot more organic than maybe, at the entry level, where you're doing maybe a bit more like formulated questions. And obviously the process is much more intensive, in those leadership levels of hiring. But I do think there's been a broader shift in the market altogether, just in people being more vocal about, what they're looking for, and who they are, and what kind of environment they can be successful in. And I think companies are asking people more like, what kind of environment, do you work well? And especially now with the shift to like remote working, hybrid work environments, some people still prefer and thrive in an office environment. Some people prefer, to have flexibility. Some people only want exclusive opportunities. And I've heard, people in my network talk about how like, oh yes, I ruled that company out or that particular opportunity out because it didn't have XYZ that I was looking for. So I think there's, been a bit of a shift, and I think people are being more vocal and more particular about being authentic to to what they really want in a job opportunity, and then finding the organization that's a fit for it, as opposed to trying to like craft the way they present themselves to match what that organization is looking for.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's I honestly too, I'm more interested in candidates that are evaluating that fit. Like to me, that's really critical. Even if there's like an element of the fit where they're like they question, I still feel like that person is going to be more successful if you hire them. Like to me, I actually find it a huge yellow flag if somebody doesn't ask any questions related to like whether or not it's a fit or the company, or like you're just gonna blind faith that
Take
where
anything.
you're putting your income is. And I mean, look, and that's, I get, like, to be clear, we're talking about the tech industry where folks have options. They're very
Yep.
lucky to be where they are in life. And there's a lot of
Yep.
people out there that don't have, don't have these types of options. They're going to take whatever and
Right.
they're going to just accept it. We're talking about the tech industry where there's a big talent shortage. And if
Yes.
somebody's just gonna like with blind faith, just like accept like whatever's handed to them without asking critical questions about the leadership team, the product, the culture, their point of impact. It's like, do you really want that person on your team? I don't. I really don't. If somebody's not asking those critical questions, I'm not interested in working with them. I'm just not.
Yeah, I mean, I remember conversations in the past where, we debriefed after a candidate and the feedback was like, it felt like they were running from something. They were just
Yeah.
like really desperate to get somewhere else than where they were. And so they weren't necessarily being very like purposeful about what they were looking for. So I think sometimes it can come across as like, hey, I just need to make a move quickly because maybe I'm not in a favorable situation, versus somebody who's like making a very thoughtful move that's, aligned with kind of where they want their growth to be. And I think the other part is like, in asking those questions, it also helps the organization understand what's important to you. If somebody asks 10 follow-up questions around equity, compensation, bonus, how's the bonus paid out, all valid questions, and that
Mhm.
helps like where that person is going to be focused. If somebody's asking lots of questions around like, well, what does the team structure look like, and what does the reporting look like, and how many people are on the team, and who's the manager, and what's the manager's kind of reputation in the company, that's going to give an indication of what's important to that person. So I think in those people asking questions, it also helps the organization understand what's important to them, and where they may need to make sure that they're giving lots of information to make this person secure that that they're making the right decision, as much as we need to be secure that we're making the right decision. So the more questions that are asked, I think it's beneficial for all parties involved. But yeah, when people are not being very thoughtful about what they need in a role, it does give me cause for concern, because ultimately, whether you identify it up front or not, it's going to come out at the end. Once you get there, those things that frustrate you or that you didn't realize or that you didn't ask questions about, they're still going to have an impact, and they're still going to influence your decision to stay at that company. You'll have just missed the opportunity to air those out before you joined, versus the person who's asking those questions in the interview process.
I actually think of the applicant tracking system and scorecards and custom questions. Like there should be fields for, was this person an active participant in the conversation, asking good questions? Like that's not something like, okay, there might be this kind of anecdotal or, hiring manager said, oh, that person was, seems really sharp. Why, right? I mean, like, I don't think there a big enough emphasis is put on how, the quality of the questions that the candidates are asking. It's not clearly defined in any feedback that's passed along throughout the hiring process. It usually just like lives in somebody's head. And I feel like one thing that I would like
Like,
to
how do you
see,
quantify that? Yeah.
yeah, it should be done more, because again,
Yep.
it's one of the biggest critical thinking, independent thinking, self-awareness. These are all things that, I'm not, maybe there's people that aren't in players who have those skill sets, but every A player that I know, top performer, is thinking critically, independently. They're aware of themselves, they're aware of their environment, they want to learn, they're intellectually curious, right? They want to understand how the engine of the car works, right? They're looking at these types of things, and I think we should put a bigger emphasis on that in the interview process, and make sure that it's being reviewed as part of the hiring process more
Yeah,
than
and
it is, I think.
if you break down like, how long the actual interview process is, for what type of decision you're making, right? Like, let's say there's 3 rounds between 30 minutes and 45 minutes each, depending on the type of role. You're doing an intro for, maybe 10 of those minutes, and then you're kind of going through like skill set stuff. And so cumulatively, maybe 3-4 hours for most roles to make a decision on whether I should leave the place that I've established myself at and try to join somewhere completely new. Like, that's not a lot of time for a decision of that large scope. And so I want somebody who's maximizing every minute of that time to make sure they're making the right decision, as much as we owe it to them to make sure we're maximizing their time as an organization. I always start conversations with candidates by asking, like, hey, I understand you met with so-and-so before you met with me. What questions can I answer for you regarding what they shared with you to help add any color, fill in any gaps? Because I generally know what's being covered in those calls, and there's always gaps. There's intended to be gaps because the conversations are supposed to be progressive. So there's not one time where a screening call is going to give you all of the information you need to know. There's certainly something you should have walked away with being like, I wonder about this. And so when someone's like, nope, no questions, I think I know everything I need to know from that 30-minute screen with the recruiter, I'm like, okay, well, great.
I hate that stuff. Yeah, like I'll do the final rounds like for my company, and when I get I think, Andrea or Bridget, they did a pretty good job explaining everything. I'm like, what? Like,
I'm like, as much as I know that they do a great job with the screen, right? I'm not just like, it's not practical to have covered everything in that amount of time. So there has to be something that's still left open to cover.
I don't move forward with those hires. Like, even if they're recommended from the previous interviews, like, I just doesn't work for me. I want people that are curious, that want to learn more. And at a minimum, even if they feel like they know the scope of the role, they could be asking about my leadership style or what I have seen be successful in the environment, but like, don't come to the final round interview and ask me about PTO. Like, like, just figure that you should have asked that like 2 interviews ago. And it's fine. Like,
Chat GPT could probably come up with some better questions than that.
I know. I don't know. Again, I don't mind. Of course, like, those questions are valid, but this is your career. You're making a huge life decision.
Yep. And the level of analysis we're expecting you to make in your role, I'd like to see you demonstrate some of that for your own benefit and well-being as part of this recruitment process. Yeah. So if the job that, I'm considering you for entails like, a lot of strategic thinking, interfacing with leadership, being able to push back, ask questions, challenge, and then in the interview process itself, you do none of that.
Yeah.
It's going to make me question whether you're the right fit for that role.
Well, I think it's like a lot of hiring managers and leaders were focused on kind of behavioral interviews and trying to identify behavior from previous roles or in their current role, but they're missing like the fact that you can look at their behavior of how they act in the interview process. Beyond like, and I'm not talking about like basic stuff like, oh, they were 20 minutes late to the call or they no-showed. Like, I'm not talking about that. But like how they engage with you and how they're asking questions and, how they're problem solving, or they look at, okay, how do I get to this offer stage, or if I'm going to want this position or not. These are all indicators of behavior, as you said, right? It's like, we should focus, I think, more on how they're actually interacting with us.
Even something as simple as, closing out the call, when a person says, so what are the next steps from here? What can I expect from your organization in terms of the remainder of the recruitment process? Who's going to follow up with me? What timeline? All of these things are things that they should be asking. It helps me understand how invested they are in the process. If somebody's just like, okay, well, let me know. I'll just, whatever you call, it's fine. They're either not very actively looking, or maybe they have a lot of companies that they're engaging with and ours may not be a priority among the total group of them. But if someone's like, okay, so, I've had this call, what would additional steps look like? What would the timeline be? What exposure would I have to other members of the team? Like, that's somebody to me who's giving serious consideration to our opportunity, trying to understand, what the next steps look like so they can plan around that. And that's someone who seems to be engaged and invested in the process, and I want to engage back with them. So all of those indicators, I think, are the things that sometimes get missed. Like you said, behavioral interview questions are, they have their place in the world, and I don't think they're going away anytime soon. But that's not necessarily the best and only indicator of whether somebody's going to be a good fit. There are often cues that are like hitting us in the face about whether somebody's going to be a good fit. I remember we had a person, the previous organization who was going through the interview process, and things happen. Calls need to be rescheduled, and obviously we try our best to be respectful of people's time. But they were very frustrated that a call had gotten rescheduled, and while they have every right to be frustrated, my perspective is you might be really frustrated working at an organization. If a call being rescheduled frustrates you to that extent, you're going to be very frustrated working here, because that happens all the time. And it's not necessarily something that people are going to like fall over themselves to apologize for either. It's like, okay, hey, we had to shuffle some things around, so we'll kick this, to tomorrow. So even things like that, in terms of like, how someone responds to the way your organization moves through the recruitment process, will sometimes give you an indication of whether that person is going to thrive within your organization. So all of those things should be things that we're kind of keeping an eye out, in addition to, do they have the skill set?
Yeah.
Is this kind of what they saw their next step being?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's like really, honestly, this kind of stuff is actually how I make hiring decisions at Secure Vision. Like I emphasize that as long as there's like a basic skill set in place, I'm all for it. Like I would much rather have the person like this, maybe that doesn't meet all the criteria, than somebody who's great on paper, but like I just don't get that vibe from, where maybe vibe is too loose of a term, but kind of demonstrates
The
the traits
energy.
that we're,
Yeah.
it's like the critical thinking nature. Like,
Yeah.
I just think it's just, anyways, yeah, we're definitely on the same page. And Britt,
Yes.
we're coming up on time here. I wanted to say thank you for joining us today. We covered a lot of ground, and
Thanks for
I know there's a
having
lot of
me.
value here. So thank you.
And I appreciate it. It was great to chat, and just kind of talk through some of the experiences I had and some of the things that I've taken away from my experiences over the years. So hope it's been insightful to anybody who's listening.
Definitely. Definitely has been. And for everybody tuning in, thank you so much for joining us, and we will talk to you next time. Take care.